So that's why we say that the lessons from spaceflight directly apply to almost any business, whether you're running a hot dog stand or working in a restaurant, like we said, or other venue. These are life lessons, and you can, even the operational way of thinking, you apply to every aspect of your life, right? And how you're going to plan your day. What order should you do things in, and what happens if this goes wrong and this doesn't work out? Do you have a backup plan?
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Keynote Curators Podcast. I'm Seth Deckman, your Keynote Curator. Today, we have an amazing guest where we're going to explore leadership, innovation, and human potential. And the one and only Dr. Leroy Chiao is our guest, former astronaut and commander of the International Space Station. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Chiao.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I'm a little bit of a space closet nerd. It all started back when we drove from the New York metro area down to our grandparents in Florida and stopped at Cape Canaveral, right when the shuttle program was kind of commencing, and they were building that road that the carrier took the space shuttle out. When it was loaded, it went, I think, 1 mile an hour. And just since then, I've always been fascinated and followed it. I just want to launch right into it. 229 cumulative days in space is quite an accomplishment. Very few people have that. What do you think is the most significant thing that experience has kind of shaped you in how you approach leadership and problem solving?
Sure. Well, it's the way that we were doing things at NASA. I came in the heart of the shuttle program. Like you, I was inspired as a young person. For me, though, it was the Apollo 11 moon landing. I was 8 years old when we landed on the moon. So then it became my dream from that point on. I'd always loved airplanes and rockets, built a lot of models, flew a lot of model airplanes and model rockets. So it was always my dream. And so I was fortunate enough as I got older to be able to apply to NASA and meet the qualifications, get interviewed, and then selected. And so I was brought into NASA during the heart of the shuttle program. And, what the way it worked then is we would get assigned to shuttle missions, and each successive mission, depending on your performance before, you would be given more responsibility and more leadership. And so that happened. My first mission was a science mission. So we went up and spent 2 weeks in space operating what's known as the Space Lab module. That was part of the shuttle program. And that was before we had ISS. So that was the main way we used to do research work. And then my next mission, I was given more experience. I had more experience. I was given more leadership, and I got to lead my first 2 spacewalks, and go outside and lead my first 2 spacewalks. And then on my third mission, I was the spacewalk lead on basically the second major assembly mission of the ISS program. So I was in charge of all the development and all the, kind of refining the procedures and, leading the teams outside to do that work. And then culminating with my space station mission where I had the most responsibility. So along the way, I definitely picked up leadership tips by example. The commander of my second and third shuttle mission was an Air Force colonel, a guy named Brian Duffy. I really admired him, his leadership style, and learned a lot from those experiences. As opposed to, as always with leadership, you see bad examples too, right? You learn a lot from those. The fact you probably learned more from that. I saw people with explosive tempers and, kind of berate people, and quickly learned that was not a good way to do things. I will say that I was not a natural born leader. I wouldn't say that I was one of those kids that was kind of leading the pack and all that. So it was definitely a learned, trait for me to learn the valuable lessons of leadership and be able to apply them and be successful, culminating with my space station mission.
That's interesting that, first of all, how many people go into space? The percentage is clearly less than 1% of planet Earth, and probably less than, 1/100th of a percent or something like that. And you spent so much time out there, and not being a natural born leader, those were skills that you really had to acquire. I'm going to make a big, broad jump here. You and I work together. You've keynoted clients of mine, and you work with meeting professionals, all industries, all sizes of events. A little known fact, you may be aware of this, but many meeting professionals who are out there dealing with vendors and catering and hotel and food and beverage and rooms and transportation and AV and speakers are often, they self-relate as introverts. Yet they
Huh.
have to demonstrate and execute being a leader. They're a point person often for the whole. Everything kind of swivels on them, a little bit like you up there on the space station. What could you say to those where naturally your inclination is to not get out in front of the pack, as you said, but where you have to kind of dig in and take the reins?
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about their jobs in that way, but I can see it now that you pointed it out. And I will point out also that when I was a young person, I was a little bit more of an introvert. I was definitely more of a nerd, reading books and building models and messing around with electronic kits and things like that. And I was not a good public speaker. In seventh grade, I remember in social studies, we had an assignment where we had to get up in front of the class and talk about whatever we wanted, basically. But I just froze up and remember my eyelids fluttered. I just felt like I
Mm.
was going to, throw up.
Right.
And
Pass
so,
out.
yeah, absolutely, all those things. So I wasn't a natural at any of those things either. And it's just you got to force yourself out there to do it. You got to want to do it. You got to
Yeah.
want to change and
Yeah.
learn how to, be a public speaker. You have to learn how to go out and put yourself out there and meet people and not worry about maybe an awkward moment or this or that, but just talk to people, and then you have to make yourself do it, right? And the same with leadership. You have to want to be a leader. So, like I said, watch the leaders around you, your boss, your boss's boss, and kind of look for what works and what style you
Yeah.
like, and what just learn from your experiences, both good and bad. And like I said earlier, oftentimes a bad example teaches you a lot more than a good example.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I've heard, when you speak, I've heard you use the analogy. Well, there's a lot of things that I learned being in the space station, and I want to impart those. And you have to be flexible, you have to be agile, you have to modify, a plan in the moment. And then you were like, well, that kind of applies to anywhere in life, including working in a busy restaurant. And I could say the same would be for events and managing and leading big conferences. But what was unique about, in all seriousness, and I know you're being serious when you say that, because to manage a restaurant, I was a waiter many, many years
Yep.
growing up, and you've got to deal with the kitchen and you've got to deal with the front of the house and everything that happens in between. And it's multitasking and being flexible and making split second decisions in the moment, serving people, keeping focused on the mission, if you will.
Yep.
But it seems like the space station, it's a big jump from a restaurant to the space station, had a very unique set of circumstances. No, I'm gonna lay out admittedly a long-winded kind of lay the table. Maybe not even a question, but an observation here.
Okay.
Your first three missions were the vehicle was the space shuttle. Is that right?
Right. Mhm.
But when you went up to the space station, it wasn't a space shuttle. Is that accurate?
That's true. We flew on a Russian rocket and a Soyuz spacecraft.
Correct. So, first of all, share with us, just to lift the curtain a little bit, behind the veil, if you will, a little bit about the difference there, some of the challenges where you had to map on that adaptability and dancing in the moment. And then being up there for an extended period of time, and what was so unique about that we could learn from?
Sure. Well, I'm going back to your restaurant analogy. I've always said that if you could, I worked as a busboy in high school. And so I always maintained that if you can work a restaurant, you can be a good instrument pilot, because as a pilot, and by extension, an astronaut, you're constantly looking, you're in a dynamic situation, you're looking at everything, you're constantly reprioritizing on the fly what needs to be done first. And, you're monitoring your situation and trying to keep it under control. So those are all traits of a good instrument pilot and a good astronaut. As far as flying with the Russians, that was a great experience. And, like I said, on the space shuttle, yeah, we were all Americans except for, on actually all three of my missions, we had a Japanese astronaut fly with us, a Japanese national. My first one was with Chiaki Mukai, the first Japanese woman. And then on the next two, I was with Koichi Wakata, who became a good friend of mine and is still a good friend of mine. But training with the Russians, that's a whole different culture. And now we're kind of on their turf, if you will, even though we're international partners on
Right.
the space station. But if you're going to go fly on their vehicle, and even if you're not, you've got to spend about half of your time there training. And because, the core module and other components of the station are Russian modules. And you have, of course, you're working hand in hand with Russian cosmonauts, mission controllers, their management. You have to learn the language, and the Russians, of course, have to come spend half their time in Houston and do the same. But you learn their cultural differences, and how you deal with that. And that's one thing that really was interesting to me. I've always loved international travel, and got to do a lot of it at NASA. Obviously, traveling to different countries and doing experiments from scientists in different countries, and learning the subtleties. And that's one thing you have to kind of be aware of is, how do you effectively communicate with someone from this culture? As Americans, we tend to be pretty direct, kind of no nonsense, or, get along and friendly,
Sure.
but still, it's business time. Let's boom, 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 boom. And other cultures don't respond as well to that. Not every culture does, right? And so you kind of have to get to know the culture, and that helps to guide you on that bit. And the leadership part too. And I'll give you an example. And that certainly applies to leadership. In Russia, I was amazed the first time I went over. It was during there was a bit of a crisis going on. We had an astronaut on Mir, and there had been a collision, and
Was
they
that
had
Jerry? Was
seal off
that Jerry?
hatches and all
Was
that.
that Lininger?
No, that wasn't Jerry. That had happened too. But then Mike Foale was up there. He's actually British American, and he was up there, and we had this collision, and they had to seal off hatches, and there was all this kind of stuff going on, and we were in these meetings with these Russians, the Americans in Russia. It was my first trip to Russia, and these Russians would stand up and be very aggressive with each other and yell at each other. And the NASA people were kind of taken aback. Americans were not used to that, right?
Right.
Then after the meeting's over, these guys are still buddies. They're going to go out later and have a drink together or whatever. And so it was kind of interesting. We had to learn to act Russian when we were there, right? And so, for example, we were after a training session, and this is when I was a backup commander, and they were kind of berating this one member of my crew. And I kind of got up in this guy's face. I didn't stand up, but I kind of threw it back at him and say, hey, and so, he backed down. But that works over there. That's their
Right.
culture. That's how it works. And so you have to kind of be willing to do that Khrushchev, slam your shoe on the table
Sure.
bit. And then it's funny when we come back to NASA, there was an observation in the early days, like, gosh, anyone that spends any time in Russia comes back crazy, because people would come back and forget they were back at NASA in the US, and they would, forget to change their behavior back into being an American.
Right.
And people say, oh, these people are crazy. They're acting belligerent and, inappropriately and all that. But you have to be conscious of that. And that helps you to be an effective leader.
The lesson there is you got to read the room. You got to constantly be present, and not to be a pleaser or a butt kisser, but to adapt with your
Yes.
focus on the mission, but learn what ways of being kind of function and serve the bigger picture. And when you're in Russia,
Right.
the phrase is when in Rome, right?
Right.
To an extent, you still got to be true to yourself.
Yes.
Now, we mentioned Lininger that he experienced a fire. Is that right?
Mhm. Yep, sure did.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
another astronaut that I've mentioned a few times on here is Alan Bean, the late great Alan Bean,
Yes, right. Uh-huh.
who stepped on the moon, which is just blows my mind every time I mention that. But you're up there and you're doing the science and you're a commander. And so was the 229 days, take us into life on the space station a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, we used to talk about shuttle missions, which were 1 or 2 weeks in duration, as sprints. And then the space station mission is more like a marathon, right? And so I had flown 3 shuttle missions, accumulated somewhere around 30 some odd days in space. So I thought I knew everything about operating in space. And that's what everyone says. Then you get up to the space station and you learn how you're actually kind of clumsy.
Mm.
And over the next, several weeks or month, then you learn to operate a lot more smoothly. You kind of fall into a routine. The space shuttle, you're just boom, 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 boom. You're trying to get as much stuff done in the limited time you're up there. You barely have time to look out the window and snap a few photos, and then you're back on the Earth and you're like, what happened? On the
Right.
space station, you fall into a routine. It's more like a work week where, Saturdays and Sundays are much lighter. You have some time to kind of catch up and do the things you want to do, like write in your journal or take photographs of the Earth and things like that. So it's a very different life. Now, being the commander of the space station mission, the easy part is actually flying the mission. Once you're up there, everything you've been trained, everything's been, trained for everything that can possibly go wrong, hopefully. And then you just execute the plan, and you know about when you're going to go home. And so you've got this expectation. It's okay.
Right.
The real hard work is before. It's the 3.5 years of training that I did before. Like I said, learning Russian, learning the language, and the Russians learning English, and us learning each other's cultures. And of course, the cosmonauts and the astronauts, we generally just click right away because flyers, we have a
Right.
similar mindset. There's kind
Yeah.
of a kinship of sorts, and so most of us got along really well. And then you have to get to know their mission controllers and their management, get them to trust you. And the best way I knew to do that, I just instinctively knew, was I knew I had to learn Russian well. So I set out as one of my primary goals is to learn the language as well as I could. And that worked. I
Yeah.
got their management to trust me. I got the cosmonauts and the trainers to trust me because I could speak relatively well. And I was always trying
Yeah.
to speak more Russian, and that's an interesting thing too. I mean, some people, we were kind of in two camps, and I think the Russians were this way too. You had one camp that looked at the opportunity to spend, basically live half your life for several years in another country as an opportunity to get to know that culture and make friends over there and see what life is like in a different part of the world. And then the other half of the camp was, I hate this. I can't wait to get out of here.
Right.
As soon as I get there, I'm not going. I'm going to learn the bare minimum of the language. I have
Yeah.
to. And those people generally weren't too happy, And
Right.
so I was definitely fell into the camp that, hey, I'm going to embrace this as an opportunity, and that betters your leadership too, because you get the other folks to trust you, right?
I mean, look, it's understandable. There's one thing about human beings, we're certainly inconsistent and not surprising to hear, but at the same time, it is surprising to hear when you have rarefied air, pardon the pun, elite performers that have caused their life and their experience and their performance to be in NASA and be assigned to this incredibly elite mission and have an attitude of I kind of want to check it off and get it over with
Right.
versus fully dive in. I mean, look, that's the tapestry of life, right? That's the range of humanity. So I'm not surprised in that sense. Russian, it's a whole different alphabet, right? And then mapping on the culture on top of it, it's so fascinating. We in my home, we're bilingual. My wife is from Argentina. I also speak French and Portuguese. We've done our podcast in Spanish on a couple of episodes. So, my hat's off to you for quite a different language than the typical secondary one. I know you also speak Chinese. You were born in Milwaukee. Help me out with the pronunciation here. Is it Shandong?
Sandong is that.
Shandong, and that's
Yeah.
your call name. That's your call sign. Is that right?
That's right. That's my parents were both originally from Shandong province, from different ends of the province. My father was from a small farming community on the western side, and my mother was born in the beautiful port city of Qingdao on the other side. And they met each other in Taiwan. Both of them ended up on Taiwan several years after the war, and they were still pretty young back then. And then years later, they met at university in Taiwan, got married, and my older sister was born in Taiwan. Then
Wow.
by the time I came along, they had been accepted to graduate school and had come to the U.S. and were in the process of becoming naturalized citizens. And then I was born, and so grew up speaking Chinese, Mandarin Chinese in the home, and of course learned English simultaneously with people in our neighborhood and then in school. So yeah, that helped wire my brain to accept a new language.
Yeah.
I learned a little bit of German in high school, and then the Russian was easier for me in a way than a lot of people who were not bilingual.
Yeah. And boy, what a world of difference. Again, pardon the pun. Now, was that a self-appointed name, or was it anointed to you?
So the Russian tradition in their space program is when you're the commander of a vehicle, you take on a call sign that you select. So, for example, the commander of the Soyuz, Russian Air Force colonel named Salajan Sharipov, who spent the 6.5 months in space with me, he took the call sign Tinshan, which is meant heavenly mountains in Kyrgyzia on the Chinese border, near the Chinese border with Kyrgyzia. So, a lot of Americans, or not a lot, but some Americans like me, we wanted to have a call sign too. We were going to be commander of the space station, but NASA was dead set against it. They didn't want us to have call signs. So they wouldn't call us by our call sign. They would call us, there was when it's Houston calling, they just say ISS Houston. And so we could have these informal call signs,
Ah,
but I decided to take the call sign from the province where my parents were originally born.
that's so cool. Another, I want to move on to a little bit of innovation, a little bit more leadership, and just generally, work culture, workplace culture. But I can't resist. You voted for the president during the presidential election while in space. I chuckle because in today's, generously call it today's context of mail-in voting, electric voting, early voting, I'm just, oh my God, Commander Chao's vote tilted it, but it was from space. Is it legitimate or not?
Sure, sure. And I can't take complete credit for that. What happened was, we were coming up on the towards the end of the year in 2004, and I had to go back to Russia to complete my training in August in order to launch in October. And I wasn't even thinking about the election. And suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be gone. I can't. How am I going to vote in
Right.
the 2004 presidential election? Well, fortunately, one of my classmates some years before had wanted to vote in a local election. So the process, NASA had already set up the process to vote from space shuttle, which is easy to extend to the space station. So it was really actually a pretty simple process. There was a electronic ballot sent to me with a password on it, basically a Word document. And I went through, opened it up on the station with a password, went through and marked my ballot, and then closed it, saved it, and then sent it back to the registrar. And so somebody there had the password, and they opened it and tallied my votes
That's so
for me.
cool.
So it was pretty easy to make it work.
Well, we have a lot in common. We're multilingual. We both love the space station, the space program. I have not voted from space yet, but we both have twins as children. So
Ah, okay,
yeah,
great.
pretty cool.
Yeah,
I have three daughters, two of which are twins, and I know there's always that kind of unspoken, like it is among astronauts, parents of twins. That's a certain type of space program, if you will, as well.
oh, sure. Yeah. No, I have a boy and a girl. And in fact, they're graduating from high school in a couple months. So they're going to be heading off into the real world and, hopefully do well.
Yeah, they will. I'm sure they will. I'm sure. Let's talk a little bit about OneOrbit, which is your organization and the
Sure.
programs that focus on, inspiring students and professionals. Tell us a little bit about OneOrbit and the programs that you deliver, and a little bit about the work that you do.
Sure. So OneOrbit, I started with a partner of mine named Jamie Sunkel. She was a professional educator, spent almost 12 years teaching middle school science. And we met each other at another organization we were both kind of doing some work for. And we put some ideas up to them, and they didn't really want to change anything. And so I said, hey, why don't we do this ourselves? So we did. We created OneOrbit. And the euphemism for OneOrbit is, you get this one go around in life. And so our tagline is make the most of your one orbit,
Mm,
right? And so the idea was we would bring the speaking that I was already doing, the corporate events and things like that under the umbrella of OneOrbit. And then we would develop these sponsored education programs where we could get paid to go out and talk to these different groups of young people. And so we're very much a for-profit company. We kind of looked at the nonprofit side, said, well, it just doesn't feel right. We want to be kind of open. Hey, we are here. We have to make a living.
sure.
And so we were very successful in doing a lot of this stuff. We had a program going in Alaska that was sponsored by a gold mine, where we'd go around to the local community and try to inspire kids. And it was, the way the gold mine looked at it was good for them because this would give them, more motivated people in the community that they could hire from, right? And would
Yeah.
go off to school and they could hire from. And similarly, we did some programs in Kansas for Textron Aviation, similar kind of thing. We were on cruise ships. We hooked up with a cruise line. Uh, it was based in Hong Kong, called Dream Cruises, and it was kind of interesting coincidence, or not coincidence, but this is the cause was they put the art on their first ship was an astronaut and a mermaid, and they had this whole story about this love story between this astronaut and this mermaid, and so they were looking for a Chinese astronaut. And of course, the Chinese national astronauts are all still part of the military there, and they can't do anything like that. And so then they found me, and they signed us up, and Jamie and I developed these programs for their ships. And the whole idea, in the Chinese culture, the Chinese men love to gamble in general, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea was this: okay, let's get them on the ship. They bring their families.
Right.
They're off at the casino. Well, what are mom and the kids going to do, right?
Yes.
And so we were running these space education programs, and from all ages, little kids all the way up to teens, and we would tailor the program depending on the age group. But get them excited about space. Pick a topic about space, talk to them about it, have a hands-on project. And so the cruise ship was paying us to spend, it started with 2 weeks, then 4 weeks, then 6 weeks over the summertime in Asia. So we sailed on ships out of Hong Kong, out of Singapore, out of China even. And then the pandemic brought that to a crushing halt, right? And the cruise line, unfortunately, actually went out of business because it costs so much to keep those ships running. You can't just park them. And so, unfortunately, we lost that line of business. But, we kind of are, since the pandemic, have been recovering and things are stepping up. So it's good. But we've really enjoyed it. And it's kind of been broadened what I thought my speaking horizons were, dealing with children as little as kind of pre-K age, all the way up to professionals, of course.
Yeah. And you find that everybody can connect to the aspirational character of space and learning and everything that it takes. And it's just something, it's so big, again, pardon the pun, it's a moonshot, and it's just inherently so big. OneOrbit, our theme this year at the Keynote Curators is breaking orbit. And it's a little bit of a metaphor. Last year was shifting sands. We were remodeling our foundation, if you will, and for liftoff, and now we're breaking orbit. So I love that OneOrbit, metaphor, and it's just so inspiring. In terms of the technical, what's required technically, and the level of excellence, and the mental resilience. And again, I'm not likening space travel and living for a half a year on the space station with event planning, but what do you see as kind of a universal aspect to the technical and mental, the resilience and the expertise that's needed, that a habit or practices that you use where you stay focused and really let you perform at your optimal?
Yes, and that's something that we very much preach in our programs. And by the way, we have other astronauts and other professionals that participate in our program, some of the programs that we've developed or have helped develop. So in a way, we're a little bit of a micro speakers bureau, but we always go out and preach what we call operational thinking. And this is something that's drilled into us at NASA as astronauts. You need to be operational. That is, you need to, like I said, if you're a waiter in a restaurant or a busboy, you've got to scan, be aware of all what's going on. You got to reprioritize on the fly. It doesn't matter if you're waiting tables or operating an aircraft or a spacecraft. That's what you got to do. And you got to keep the big picture at all times. And we have an adage in spaceflight that's true in other walks of life too. And that's think about what you're about to do because you can always make it worse.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's true in a restaurant. That's true in a shop. So that's why we say that the lessons from spaceflight directly apply to almost any business, whether you're running a hot dog stand or working in a restaurant, like we said, or other venue. These are life lessons, and you can, even the operational way of thinking, you apply to every aspect of your life, right? And how you're going to plan your day. What order should you do things in, and what happens if this goes wrong and this doesn't work out? Do you have a backup plan? Those are all operational ways of thinking, and you can apply that to almost every aspect of your life, really.
I mean, meeting planners, we've had things where the power's gone out at a convention center.
Yeah.
Severe weather has impacted the arrival of the attendees. There's been an unfortunate plumbing, a flooding of several floors of a hotel, and the list goes on. And that's where that mindset and that agility and adaptability really comes into
Right.
play.
Yeah,
Um,
you got to be able to stay calm and focus and figure out, okay, what do I got to do first? You know,
right,
what do I have to do? What do I have to do first, second, third? Oh, wait a
right,
minute, this happened. Now, this is
right.
the most important thing that I got to work on. You know, and keeping that big picture, balancing all those spinning plates, and you know, very much so. Like you say, meeting planners, I can very much see how they have to be operational thinkers to be
Yeah.
successful.
Wait a minute. That sounds like raising a set of twins as well.
Right. That's right.
I just want to share with our listeners these great insights. Comment what you're dealing with and how you've been able to adapt, just like the commander of the space station has to at your events, your conferences, and what you're doing as far as executing when problems arise or when they go according to plan, and how satisfying that is and what the learnings are. Like us, love us, subscribe, and we just appreciate you being with us. We're kind of coming to the end here, Commander Chiao, but I did want to do a little bit of show and tell.
Sure.
I do have, this might look recognizable to
Oh
you.
yeah. Yeah.
This is the model of the Discovery, um, picked up at Cape Canaveral at the
Uh-huh.
Kennedy Space Center. And, it does open up here.
Right.
Seems familiar to you.
Oh
Pretty
yes,
cool.
very much so.
And I have a few of them. I don't want to nerd out completely, but I love the program. I love everything that it exemplifies from the beginning. We've had great scientists, great engineers, fighter pilots, space shuttle commanders, space station commanders now. And what's interesting is, I just want to finish on this and get your thoughts. This is a thesis I have, and I could be completely wrong, and I'm willing. It wouldn't be the first time today that I'm wrong. But each generation, let's say from the baby boomers forward, where we had the big moonshot, literally, relate to the space program from their perspective. So the boomers, it's this moonshot, anything is possible. Then you have the space shuttle, more the utilitarian aspect of it, the sprint aspect of it, to use your words. Then you have the space station, right? Which is
Right.
more, these are my words, communal or group or team oriented, a little bit longer term, a little bit longer term impact, consciously at least. And then what's going on with the rover and landing on Mars, and then the satellites and everything around that. What's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. I think certainly I was very young when we landed on the moon, and that had a huge impact on me. And I do remember that feeling that everybody thought, wow, anything's possible. And I think it inspired young people to want to strive. Space Shuttle was an exciting vehicle. I was being developed when I was a teenager, young teenager. And I remember building model kind of space shuttles and things like that. And like you said, it became more of a utilitarian vehicle, and in a way, NASA was a little bit of a victim of its own success because people kind of got used
Right.
to having space shuttle
Yeah.
flights, every few months. And it kind of became mundane until we had the Challenger accident. And then, of course, several years later, we had the Columbia accident. And, that spelled the eventual end of the
Right.
program. Space station is kind of the same thing. If you think about space station, it is the most incredible engineering marvel. I mean, think about it. Former World War II, Cold War enemies came together and built the most audacious structure ever even attempted in space. It's so much bigger than Space Station Mir was or anything like that. And everything actually fit together. I mean, think about it. The core module from Russia, the pieces from Russia had never touched the American piece at the interface. So how do you know it's actually going to fit?
Right.
Right? It's actually going to come
Yeah.
together, but it did. And everything worked, even these mechanisms that even the astronauts, we would look at some of these mechanisms, say, these just seem so Rube Goldberg. How could it ever work? And it
Right.
did. It all
Right.
worked.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty incredible. But by the same token, people have gotten used to missions going to the ISS until something, the big story recently was that Butch and Sonny, two
Right.
astronauts that were stuck on board in what their 8-day test flight on a Boeing Starliner turned into a 9-month odyssey, and they're thankfully back on Earth just last week. But I think the young generation, they do look at space, and you have a subset that are inspired by it. Maybe not the same impact that Apollo had on that generation, the boomer generation, but there's certainly a subset of today's
Yeah.
future astronauts that are looking at hey, return to the moon, and then SpaceX. Hey, I think SpaceX. Elon Musk just announced that in the next year or two, he's actually, maybe it might take a little bit longer. He's usually pretty optimistic, but
Sure.
he's actually going to launch a Starliner to Mars, not with people on board, but actually launch one to Mars. And so this dream of Mars, I think, is the next generation's big thing to look for because, I've always said we've been 20 years from Mars since 1969, since we went out on the moon. Nobody questioned that in 20 years we'd be on Mars. And of course, we haven't even returned to the moon since 72. So,
Right.
I think the future is exciting, but it's going to be primarily led by companies like SpaceX. And now Blue Origin has launched their New Glenn rocket. And so, I know that Jeff Bezos seems very serious about building infrastructure in what we call cislunar space, and space around the Earth and the moon. And so it's going to be an exciting future. And I think NASA will always be a part of that. And ideally, they would be because NASA's become a big bureaucracy. It's not the agency it used to be. But NASA is still the defining excellence in operations and
Yeah.
running space missions and training astronauts, executing these missions and making it look easy.
Yeah. And they do, and the level of mastery when a master makes it look easy, how much work and practice and energy and time and resources go, and the failures that have you arrive at that mastery. And not to tie the bow here, but it is true. You speak at these events. There's thousands of people, 20 plus hotels, and it's all synced together, and the doors open at a certain time, and the speakers up on the keynote stage mic'd up at a certain time, and the mag screens light up, and people are there getting an amazing experience. It's going to impact them and have a ripple effect out. So to kind of bring it full circle, whether you're washing dishes or multitasking in a restaurant or commanding the space station, there's all these universal aspects of behavior and way to perform that can apply. And so these lessons from space, Commander Chiao, we just appreciate you being our guest and sharing so much of your personal story and your personal journey. And just thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Really happy to be on and glad to have this conversation with you and wish you all the best of luck too.
You got that. And I appreciate that. I want to share with our listeners, our viewers, subscribers, first timers, return viewers and listeners. Thank you. Check us out on thekeynotecurators.com. If you love this content, great conversations with Dr. Chiao, with Commander Chiao, please check us out. You can find his profile on our website, as well as any other type of speaker you want. So we appreciate you being with us, and we feel you're smarter for it. We'll see you next time.